And now, it's The Law Show on CL 650. A comprehensive look at everything you need to know about the law.
Do you swear to tell the truth and nothing but the truth, so cross your heart? Do you swear to tell the truth and nothing but the truth, so cross your heart?
Well, you're taking part in the Law Show today, and it's great that we have our two guests in studio. We have the partners of MurphyBattista in downtown Vancouver, Joe Battista, QC, and Joe Murphy, QC, in studio. And we mentioned the last time you were here last month that it's quite rare we have you both in studio, so it's great to have the heavy hitters here. And we're talking about something that's, I'm sure, very close to what you do with personal injury, and that's soft tissue claims. Is this the number one claim that ICBC has? Do you think it's soft tissue claims?
I think it's the most common injury claim, and the standard scenario, Zach, is a rear-end collision, and the people in the car in front that are struck from behind, their head whips back, and then it whips forward, and then it whips back again. And you know that from watching engineering studies where they've put dummies in cars and hit
the
them
crash
even
test
at
dummies,
10 kilometers an hour. So that rips or stretches the soft tissues in the front and the back of the neck, and it can affect the shoulders. And over time, when someone handles themselves differently, it puts more stress maybe on their low back, or if they handle one side differently, it puts more stress on the other side. So over time, you can see situations where someone starts out with pain in the neck and right shoulder, and then they come in weeks or months later and say, I'm having problems now with my low back, which on the face of it doesn't make any sense until you realize they're doing things differently.
Your body's overcompensating, right?
Yep.
So is that hard to prove that the chronic lower back is caused from the whiplash from earlier accident? So you must have that push and pull with the insurer that, well, this is something that's not related, right?
Well, we do, because there is some subjectivity to expressing that or explaining that injury. But the key is that before the accident, they didn't have these problems. There's been nothing else intervening, and it started either at the time of the accident or shortly thereafter, and you can connect the dots and say, look, it's more likely than not caused by the accident. But unlike a broken bone where you can image for it, you can see it's broken, with a soft tissue injury, there's a lot of subjective complaints that are just as credible.
Headaches, things like that?
Headaches, but you are relying on the person self-reporting a lot of the time to explain what they're feeling, to explain the injury.
Now, I have, I go to the chiropractor regularly. I go to massage therapy regularly because I have back issues. So even though I have long-standing treatment for sore back and neck, would that preclude me from making a claim because it would be worse? Or, because wouldn't the insurer say, well, you've been dealing with neck and shoulder pain for a long time. Well, this has nothing to do with it.
Well, there's two sides to that, Zach. Number one is the fact that you've been having this treatment before suggests that this is an old problem. But the flip side, the good side, is that the therapists that you were seeing before know how you were before.
Sure.
And they're in the best position to describe how you are afterwards. The physiotherapist. So
you do have a baseline then, that's what you're saying.
Yes, and it's like professional hockey teams now do a neuropsych baseline on all their players at the beginning of a season, so that if a player has a concussion, they can test again and see what the changes are. Mm-hmm. So prior treatment, as I say, has an advantage of giving you that baseline.
Oh, so that it actually would give you an advantage to say that you have a third-party person saying, well, actually, they're worse than they were, versus somebody just says, oh, my neck hurts now where it didn't before.
Well, the challenge is trying to decide if you're left with ongoing problems, to show that those ongoing problems are different or worse because of this recent accident.
I have a story where I was literally 2 blocks from my house, and it's a narrow street, so you have to wait for the oncoming traffic to clear before you can go down, and there's cars parked on either side. So there's a fellow behind me, and he thought I rolled forward a foot or two, and he thought that I had moved up the road, and I hadn't, and he started to accelerate away and bumped the back of the car. There was no damage at all to either car. The 2 bumpers connected. The next day, I went to my chiropractor and my massage therapist, and they're like, what happened? It wasn't until a couple of days later that I remembered I had this little bump, but it was 3-4 kilometers an hour, if that, but I felt it. So it can happen.
It can, and that might be, you said you had some neck and back problems before.
Yeah.
It may be for that reason that you were somewhat vulnerable, but yes, you know, a low velocity impact can have sometimes serious consequences. We had a case in our office where a very minor impact translated into a very large award because it was incapacitating for this person. It's not the norm, but it can happen. And ICBC tends to group all these things together and say it's not possible that impact caused any injury. And this is a program that they've got. It's a business decision they make to treat them that way. I think with the expectation or the hope that a lot of people won't bother pursuing it. But there's no question that you can get injured from a low velocity impact as well.
And oftentimes it manifests itself like in migraines or the inability to focus, those sorts of things?
Well, pain can cause difficulty focusing, and a neck injury where you get the muscles in your neck inflamed, that affects the blood flow to your brain, and that can cause headaches. So headaches are, very vague. There's no way you can prove a headache or disprove a headache. But they're common with the neck injury that you get these headaches. And it's not that the head was injured, but that the blood flow to the head's affected by the spasm in the neck.
So we often refer to this as a whiplash injury. What other types of soft tissue injuries do you have? Just bruising from a car accident, for example?
Anytime your soft tissues are stretched or broken or bruised, you can have soft tissue injuries. Ligaments, a rotator cuff is the ligament in your shoulder. That can be affected when you fall if your arm is put out in a certain way, which is common to break a fall. If you have your knee injured, you can get the ligaments in the knee that are stretched or affected. So any part of the body that has soft tissue, which is every part.
Yeah.
Soft tissue is the skin, the ligaments, the muscles. It can be affected, and it's interesting because often it's the initial injury that leads to other aches and pains. So someone with a knee injury will walk differently, and it's very common if someone's walking differently and bending and lifting and carrying differently that they might develop a back problem or a shoulder problem. So you really have to be aware that the way someone acts following an injury can cause other problems. A good example of that, Zach, I think, is the fact that years ago, when Joe and I first started practicing, it was very common that someone with a neck injury would get one of these big foam collars. Mm-hmm. You saw that a lot. Mm-hmm. What they discovered, and why we see them so rarely now, is to put one of those collars around the neck leads to a weakening of all the muscles in the neck, and that causes all sorts of problems because a person can't hold their head up properly. So you can just get a variety of other injuries that flow from that. I've met probably 100 physiotherapists who've treated our clients, and it's amazing how much you can learn from a physiotherapist or a massage therapist how to lift up something from the ground. Mm-hmm. You don't bend your back, you bend your legs, and you lift straight up, and you're not going to hurt yourself. But it's the physiotherapists that spend time with these people. They've got them on the table, and they can say this muscle's in spasm. And that evidence can be very useful when there's a big dispute. Well, listen, we think this guy's faking it or exaggerating it.
Now, Joe, you and Joe, the other Joe, have been together since 1982, I'm correct, right? So MurphyBattista started then. Have you seen a change in the attitude of the courts, or when you're going through cases like this, that they're more accepting of these soft tissue injuries? Have we learned a lot since the early 80s? Are people more open to the fact that these kinds of things do happen? In the old days, you're just faking it to get an insurance claim, but now people are more open to it?
I think what we're finding is that the courts realize that these can become chronic and can become lifelong. Statistically, the vast majority of people do recover, and it's not an ongoing problem. But when it becomes chronic and develops into, or you develop fibromyalgia or some of these other types of problems, they can be very debilitating. And I think The courts, with the evolution of the science in the area, are more accepting that, yes, these can be lifelong problems. And I think the term whiplash tends to minimize the severity of the injury itself, but they can be lifelong problems. So I think the courts were always accepting if you could prove it, but now the science has caught up where, they accept things like fibromyalgia, where a lot of it is subjective complaints. You can't image for it. You have to rely on the person, and it's important that you have a credible client, which
you try to establish, right?
Exactly.
Now, are the insurers settling these things more readily than they were in the past? Were they fighting, saying, "Oh, this is just somebody looking for some money," versus now they realize that these sorts of situations are real?
Well, Zach, ICBC publishes the figures every year, and we know from those figures that they settle more than 99.5% of their injury claims. Mm-hmm. So it's less than 1 in 100 that goes to trial. They're settled because ICBC understands what a likely court award will be, and the lawyer acting for the person understands what a likely court award, and they come up with some number that both can live with. Very few go to trial, but as Joe said, the difference today compared to 20, 30, 40 years ago is that the world recognizes the potential long-term impact of a whiplash injury. Whereas years ago, there was really little understanding of the long-term impact. So the awards years ago gave money for pain and suffering and income loss and expenses, but they didn't really recognize that there'd be big future losses. And now the courts, in the right case with the right evidence, recognize that.
That's the voice of Joe Murphy. Also joining us in studio is Joe Battista of MurphyBattista in downtown Vancouver. We're talking about soft tissue claims and how it affects you and maybe a family member on The Law Show next on CL 650.
There's more of the show still ahead. This is The Law Show on CL 650.